If you've spent any time learning about MBTI, you've probably noticed something strange. The same cognitive function can seem completely different depending on which personality type is using it. So which description is actually correct? The answer is all of them. Let's find out why. Part 1. Understanding the function. Introverted sensing is a cognitive function concerned with preserving, referencing, and interpreting personal experience. It naturally pays attention to what has already been experienced, what was noticed before, and how the present compares to an internal record of the past. Rather than simply asking, what is happening right now, introverted sensing tends to ask, how does what is happening now relate to what I already know? This gives introverted sensing a strong relationship with familiarity and consistency. When something is encountered, the mind can compare the current experience against previous experiences, how something felt, what worked last time, what went wrong before, what details stood out, or what conditions were present when a particular outcome occurred. The past isn't necessarily being revisited for nostalgia. It's being used as a reference point for understanding the present. That internal reference system can include much more than factual memories. It can involve physical sensations, emotional impressions, routines, environmental details, and subtle differences that are difficult to explain until you've experienced them yourself. Someone using introverted sensing might notice that a situation feels slightly different from normal even before they can explain exactly why, because some part of the current experience doesn't quite match their established internal reference. At its core, introverted sensing is motivated by understanding and maintaining what is known and reliable. It wants to know what can be trusted because it has been experienced, tested, observed, or established over time. This makes the function especially useful for recognizing patterns of consistency, preserving useful knowledge, maintaining standards, and learning from accumulated experience. But introverted sensing is often misunderstood as simply being good memory. Memory can certainly be involved, but the function is doing something more specific than storing information. The important part is the relationship between past experience and present perception. Two people might remember the same event, but introverted sensing is especially interested in the personal significance and sensory details of that experience, and in how those details can inform what is happening now. It also isn't inherently traditional, conservative, rigid, or resistant to change. A person can use introverted sensing to recognize that an old method no longer works just as easily as they can use it to preserve a method that does. The function isn't saying the past is always right. It's saying the past contains information, so let's not ignore what we've already learned. In that sense, introverted sensing serves as a kind of internal reference library. It gives the mind continuity. Instead of treating every new situation as completely disconnected from everything that came before it, introverted sensing allows previous experience to remain relevant. And the more trusted this function becomes, the more confidently a person can use that internal library to navigate the present. That brings us to what happens when introverted sensing occupies the hero position. Part 2. Hero Function. The hero types are ISFJ and ISTJ. When introverted sensing is the hero function, the person has a deep and relatively confident trust in their accumulated experience. Their internal reference system isn't something they occasionally consult. It is one of their primary ways of making sense of reality. They naturally notice what has happened before, what has proven reliable, and how the current situation compares with established experience. This can make the person exceptionally grounded in what they actually know. If they've done something successfully many times, they don't necessarily need to reinvent the process every time they do it. They can draw on previous experience and recognize the small details that tend to make a difference. If a machine starts making a strange sound, for example, they may remember that a similar sound previously indicated a specific problem. If a recipe consistently works when prepared a certain way, they know why changing one of those steps might produce a different result. The confidence of the hero position also means that experience can become a source of authority. Rather than constantly wondering whether their internal reference is legitimate, the person can trust that what they've observed and learned has value. They may become the person others rely on when something needs to be done correctly, consistently, or according to an established standard. But that same confidence can create a blind spot. When your internal reference system has repeatedly helped you navigate the world, unfamiliar approaches can sometimes look less useful simply because they haven't earned that same level of trust yet. A new method might work perfectly well, but if it contradicts years of accumulated experience, the person may naturally want evidence before abandoning what they already know. The important distinction is that this isn't necessarily fear of change. It's a preference for change that has a reason behind it. Hero introverted sensing wants new information to be integrated into an existing understanding rather than replacing that understanding without explanation. And when this function becomes responsible not just for guiding the individual, but for supporting the people around them, we move into the parent position. Part 3. Parent Function. The parent types are ESFJ and ESTJ. When introverted sensing occupies the parent position, the function becomes something the person can use responsibly and reliably to guide themselves and others. They aren't simply drawing on experience because it feels comfortable. They're often using what they've learned to create stability, prevent avoidable problems, and make sure important details don't get overlooked. This can show up in surprisingly practical ways. Someone with parent introverted sensing might remember how a particular task caused problems last time and make sure the same mistake doesn't happen again. They might keep track of established procedures, remember what someone prefers, know where important things are kept, or recognize that a seemingly minor detail has caused major problems in the past. There's also a strong helping quality here. Because introverted sensing can preserve details about previous experiences, it can help someone support others based on what they already know. If a friend has struggled with something before, they may remember what helped. If a coworker has a particular way of doing something that consistently produces good results, they can account for that rather than treating every situation as interchangeable. The parent position tends to take reliability seriously. It wants people to be able to depend on what has been established, whether that's a routine, a standard, a process, or simply the knowledge gained from doing something repeatedly. There's often a quiet satisfaction in knowing that things are being handled properly because the lessons of previous experience haven't been forgotten. The potential problem is becoming overly responsible for maintaining that stability. When someone feels responsible for keeping things working, they may become frustrated when others ignore lessons that seem obvious to them. They can also place too much weight on established procedures when a situation genuinely requires something new. Healthy parent introverted. Sensing isn't about forcing everyone to repeat the past. It's about taking the past seriously enough to learn from it, while still recognizing when circumstances have changed. And when introverted sensing moves further down the stack, that same function becomes less responsible and more playful. Part 4. Child Function. The child types are INFP and INTP. In the child position, introverted sensing has a much lighter relationship with experience. Instead of feeling like something the person has to be responsible for, it can become a source of comfort, enjoyment, and personal familiarity. The function gets to play with experiences rather than constantly manage them. This can create a surprisingly sentimental relationship with the past. A familiar food, an old game, a particular place, a childhood routine, or even a very specific sensory experience can become enjoyable simply because of what it represents personally. The value isn't necessarily that the thing is objectively better than anything new, it's that it connects the person to something known and meaningful. Child introverted sensing can also enjoy collecting little pieces of experience. Someone might become fascinated with remembering obscure details about something they love, comparing different versions of an experience, or returning to something familiar just to appreciate what they liked about it in the first place. There's an innocence to this position, because the function doesn't always have to justify itself. The person can simply enjoy knowing what they know. They can take pleasure in a familiar routine, or laugh about how something used to be done without needing that experience to become a strict rule for the future. At the same time, the child position can be immature. The person may sometimes cling to familiar experiences simply because they're comforting, or become disproportionately attached to the way they remember something. They might resist changing a small personal routine, not because the change is objectively bad, but because the familiar version feels better. Growth comes from learning that familiarity and reliability don't have to mean stagnation. The function becomes stronger when the person can enjoy their accumulated experience while remaining open to discovering that new experiences can eventually become part of that internal reference system too. That playful relationship is very different from what happens when introverted sensing sits in the inferior position. Part 5. Inferior Function. The inferior types are ENFP and ENTP. When introverted sensing is the inferior function, the person can admire the stability, certainty, and grounded knowledge that introverted sensing provides without feeling naturally confident using it. They may recognize the value of experience and consistency while simultaneously feeling trapped by them. This can create an interesting tension. On one hand, the person may want the freedom to explore possibilities and move towards something new. On the other hand, there can be an underlying insecurity about whether they've paid enough attention to what came before, whether they've missed an important detail, or whether they can trust their own accumulated experience. Because the function is less conscious and less comfortable, it can sometimes appear in extremes. A person who normally feels energized by possibilities may suddenly become intensely concerned with details, routines, physical comfort, or past mistakes when they're under stress. Instead of calmly using experience as a reference, they can become preoccupied with everything that could go wrong because of something they failed to notice before. For example, someone might suddenly fixate on whether they remembered every small detail, whether they followed the correct procedure, or whether one previous mistake is evidence that they're incapable of handling the situation. The normally useful reference system becomes less like a library and more like a list of everything they might have gotten wrong. But inferior introverted sensing isn't simply a weakness. It also represents something the person can grow toward. Developing a healthier relationship with experience can give them something they may deeply appreciate: continuity. Instead of seeing the past as something that limits future possibilities, they can learn to see it as information that supports those possibilities. They don't have to abandon exploration in order to learn from experience. They can experiment, discover what works, remember it, and carry that knowledge forward. Over time, this can produce moments where the inferior function suddenly feels much more trustworthy. The person realizes that they actually have a wealth of experience to draw upon and that they don't need to remember everything perfectly or follow every established method in order to benefit from what they've learned. The challenge is learning to use introverted sensing without demanding certainty from it. The function doesn't need to predict exactly what will happen. It only needs to preserve what has been experienced well enough for that experience to remain useful. And that's the deeper lesson of introverted sensing across all four positions. The function itself remains the same. Whether it is confidently trusted, responsibly guiding, playfully explored, or anxiously admired from a distance, introverted sensing is always concerned with the relationship between present experience and what has already been lived, noticed, and learned. By now, hopefully you've seen that this cognitive function never actually changed. Whether it appeared as the hero, parent, child, or inferior function, it was always the same underlying cognitive process. What changed was the person's relationship with it. One position trusted it instinctively, another used it to support others, another approached it with comfort and curiosity, and another admired it while struggling to fully trust it. In the next video, we'll continue by exploring how this same cognitive function appears in the shadow through the nemesis, critic, trickster, and demon functions.